Chapter 1. A Sky Like Robin's Eggs. The sky was blue, the color of a robin's eggs. I saw a nest of them once while climbing a neighbor's tree. I was 8 at the time, and hunting for a stray frisbee. My brother, the jackass, had thrown it next door. I didn't remember the reason why, that part was hazy, but I would never forget my surprise at finding the eggs. They sat in their nest like treasures. That was 56 years ago, practically a lifetime. As I watched, a smattering of clouds scudded across the sky. The wind up there must really be blowing for them to move like that. Down below, where I was, the breeze was gentle, swaying the grass around me. I looked around and realized I was laying on my back on a hillside. Down below in the distance, a line of trees marked the edge of a forest. Fields and crops stood in between, while further up the hill was a tall wall, like the kind you'd find in a Miyazaki film. The stones were cartoonish in their size and assembly. They reached up at least 20 feet, though, and seemed sturdy. I didn't remember coming to this place. My last memory was of leaving the office. I worked as an office manager for a small production company making documentary films for the education market. The weather report predicted freezing rain in the afternoon, so I cut out of work early to beat the bad weather and traffic. The next thing I knew, I was on the hillside with no sign of cold or rain. If anything, the air was balmy. The breeze felt good ruffling across my body. My body? I lifted my hands and saw them smaller than they should be. No hair or calluses. None of the tiny scars that one gathers over time. They were innocent hands, untouched by life. And the rest of my body matched. I was no longer 64 years old, but a child instead. Did I slip and hit my head? Was I unconscious? Dreaming? The sky, the scent of the grass, and the way the rocks prodded my back, those all felt real, but my thoughts and emotions felt muffled. I recognized that something very wrong had taken place, but the alarm was distant, as if under a thick blanket of mild acceptance. Minutes passed, an hour or two. I didn't wake up. Nothing happened except for the clouds moving across the sky. More time passed. My body became hungry, and the feeling of emptiness grew until some boundary was crossed. My distant mind registered that I should eat. I stood. On my feet were a pair of leather shoes. I wore thick woolen pants and shirt. They were simple clothes, but well made. I peeked inside the pants. Still male. At least that didn't change. I walked uphill and followed the line of the wall. Where there were people, there would be food. And I found my first person after 20 minutes of walking. A man stood at the gate to the town. He wore chainmail over a thick cloth jacket. Over his shoulder rested a spear. I stood there amazed. Even my distant thoughts went silent. It was a long time since I'd been to a Renaissance fair, and I didn't expect to come across one so randomly. The guard at the gate grew more and more uneasy as I stared at him. The spear went from resting on his shoulder to being readied for use. His knuckles went white, gripping the haft. He yelled out, threatening me with his spear. An armored woman came out to join him. They exchanged words, and I understood none of them. The language sounded like nothing I'd heard before. The woman also had a spear and joined in threatening me. Their faces were ugly with fear. I wanted to come closer to explain that I was dreaming or unconscious or in a coma, that none of this was real, but I couldn't think through the strange feeling in my head. So I just stood there. I knew the situation was wrong, but I wasn't capable of addressing it. Eventually, a person wearing robes stepped through the gate. They wore a mask in the shape of a crow and carried a wooden hoop 2 feet across. More words were exchanged, and the 2 guards were grateful to step back. The crow sang some words and raised their hoop to the sky. In the distance, thunder rumbled in reply. I looked up, but the clouds hadn't changed. The space inside the hoop twisted. I was curious to see what would happen and came closer, until a snake, mottled black and green, poked its head out from inside the hoop. The snake's glare snapped me from my daze and sent me running down the hill, through the fields and into the trees. I ran and ran, not paying attention to the brush and branches. Headlong through the forest I went, driven by fear and something inside me screaming, for I knew that I wasn't dreaming. I knew that somehow. I was somewhere else, and that everything familiar was gone. I don't know for how long I ran, but it felt endless. If I keep going like this, I'm going to die. The thought stopped me cold, my feet skidding on the forest loam. Slowly, the muffling of my thoughts eased a notch. Enough that I could think again, so I did. I considered everything I had experienced so far. I noted the sweat drenching my shirt, my hand on my side because of the stitch there, the way my shoes squelched from the burnt blisters and blood inside them. I considered it all, and was sure that this was not a dream. And then I had my second coherent thought. If there's a wall, there's something to keep out. Something dangerous. The fear I'd been feeling all this time jumped into my throat, and the muffling came back to press it down. I stood helpless for 10-15 minutes before the pressure eased. My thoughts were jumbled, scattered, but I knew I couldn't panic. I had to keep a lid on my emotions, because if I didn't, something else would do it for me and turn me into a vacant-eyed copy of myself. What does one do when lost in the woods? At least that answer came to mind easily. Shelter, water, food. It was drummed into me by mi abuelo the first time he took me hunting. I start moving through the forest, looking for a safe place to camp. The trees were a mix of pine, cedar, hemlock, spruce, and maple. Those were the familiar ones. There were some that weren't familiar, though. One had a black, furry bark and reddish pods hanging from its branches. Another was striped yellow, the leaves smelling like cardamom. My heart beat hard when I saw those trees. All I needed was a horned rabbit or a goblin to seal the deal. Another world. Chapter 2. 2 aphorisms. Or is it 3? The world spun, and I desperately wanted to sit down. I was afraid, though, that if I sat, I wouldn't be able to get up again. My feet were on fire from the burst blisters, the pain radiating up into my legs and groin. I walked, stumbling a little, and looking for a safe place to rest. My priorities hadn't changed. I still needed to find shelter, water, and food. But now added to the list was information. Information to explain what happened to me. One step at a time, I said, whispering to myself. There were no obvious places to shelter nearby, and I was forced to keep walking. There was no denying, though, that I was lost. The forest stretched in all directions, one as good as any other. Thinking that water flows downhill, I headed towards a slight slope. But 15 minutes later, I stopped again. The pain made my eyes water, and I didn't trust moving through the forest without being able to see. I was resting, leaning against a maple, admiring the cool of its trunk, when an animal chittered in the distance. Assuming it was an animal, for all I knew it could have been a giant spider or carnivorous plant. Whatever it was, it encouraged me to limp onward. The going was slow, this part of the forest thick with branches and brambles. My clothes were covered with small tears. The cloth was dotted red from the small cuts on my body. I was considering my options when a twig snapped behind me. I glanced back and spotted a baboon-like creature with a blue snout and reddish fur. It was broader across the chest than a baboon, taller too, but what stood out most were the teeth. Long, sharp teeth meant for eating meat. The creature was stalking me. Adrenaline flooded my system, and I ran. My feet be damned, I ran with all I could, the whole world narrowing to the path ahead. My only advantage was that I was small and nimble. I kept the baboon at bay by weaving between the trees and slipping between branches, but it was tenacious, chittering as it gave chase. I knew it was physically impossible for me to outrun it. It was stronger and faster, but I've learned never to give up. The one thing I was best at in my life was dogged persistence. All my real successes came from it, and so I kept running and looking for anything to change the dynamics of the chase. To my right, a tree had fallen, and beyond it, the ground fell away toward a steep hillside. There was less cover, but I took the chance, ducking under the fallen tree to throw myself down the slope. I rode the loam for 20 feet before I nearly lost an eye jamming up against a low-hanging tree branch. Meanwhile, the baboon overshot, continuing along the way I'd been going before it swung around toward me. The slope below was broken by a rocky outcropping. I scrambled towards it, looking for another obstacle to extend the chase. Instead, I found salvation, a fissure in the rocks just wide enough for a small child. My feet splashed through a rill of water as I squeezed myself inside. The baboon arrived moments later. Furious, it pounded at the stones with its fist. The small space reverberated with the impacts. All the more reason to push myself further inside toward a small hollow at the back. I curled up and waited, but the baboon didn't give up. It found a branch long enough to reach and poked into the hollow to get at me. I batted the branch aside, earning new scratches each time. When the first branch didn't work, the baboon smashed it against the rocks and found another. When that didn't work, it found a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. Finally, the baboon howled, raging at the injustice of lost prey, and gave the stone one last strike before departing. It was all I could do to hold on for 10 minutes to make sure it wasn't a trick, before letting myself pass out. I woke up a bloody and battered mess. At least my injuries scabbed over while I slept. A dim part of my mind worried about infection and tetanus. That thought woke me right up, but I sagged back down immediately. The nearest antibiotics and tetanus antitoxin were a world away. Water flowed through the hollow in a trickle, and I reached down for some, my hand trembling. It took 2 attempts to bring a handful to my mouth. The water tasted clean but rusty, probably from the dried blood on my hands. Normally, I'd worry about contaminants, but My belly was empty, and I was desperately thirsty. In for a penny, in for a pound. After drinking my fill, I stared at the rock. My thoughts hung on the fact that I was in another world, and all I've said so far were aphorisms. I can do better than that, I said, but then wondered if that too was an aphorism. I shook the muddy thought from my head. My death had been just moments away. I needed to focus if I wanted to survive. Panic, denial, and distraction would only lead to tragedy. I crawled out of the fissure, careful to make sure there were no predators nearby. Once outside, I followed the rill down the hillside. We meandered for a time, me and the rill, but eventually we were reunited with her big sister, a stream just wide enough for a man to throw a stone and reach the other side. I expected to be more heartened by the sound of running water. It was, after all, one of my goals, but I hesitated, keeping my distance. I needed to work up the courage to look into the water, and when I did, I saw that my face was not my own. The shock rolled through me, waking up the thing muffling my emotions, causing it to spread a blanket over me. Looking past the cuts and scabs, I distantly noted that I still looked half Hispanic, but now the other half was Chinese. The face I wore had prominent cheekbones, with dark eyes, and I could already tell those were going to be some bushy eyebrows when I grew older. On top of it all was a shock of black hair. I sat back and let the new face sink in. Eventually, the days would pass, and then I'd head upstream. I heard the roar of a waterfall in the distance. Chapter 3. Introducing 8. The glen was shaped like a ladle, a waterfall pouring down 40 feet of limestone cliffside to a pool circled by marble, chalky stone, and flint. Enough water fell for the roar and mist to fill the air. Even so, there was a peaceful spirit to the glen, the kind you'd find tucked away in the wilderness on a deep hike. "Hello, beautiful." I sighed. Apparently I'd moved from aphorisms to pickup lines. Shaking my head, I knelt to drink my belly full. This water was clear, cool, and, more importantly to my stomach, there were fish darting about in the pool. Shelter first, I told myself. The day was darkening, and there wasn't much time left to find a place to sleep. If necessary, I could return to the fissure in the rocks, but my feet were hurting badly. It was tempting to pull together some fallen branches and make a lean-to against the cliff face. As I dragged the first branch over, I heard the water echo. Was there a gap in between the water and the cliff? I dropped the branch and moved to investigate. A gap in the sheeting water randomly opened and closed, but I couldn't see anything beyond it. I'd have to risk getting drenched for a better look. "Excuse me, gentle lady, but needs demand I look behind your skirt." I froze. Did that really just come out of my mouth? What was going on with my brain? Had it turned to mush in the transformation from man to child? I wanted to slap myself. So I did. Not hard, but enough for the shock to wake me from my muffled thoughts. Feeling better, I pressed ahead, pushing through the sheeting water. The stone was slippery, and, small as I was lucky I didn't slip. I made it through, though, and saw an open space between the water and the stone. The cave was 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep, give or take. Moss covered the ground, but there was no evidence of anything using the space as a den. It was mine if I wanted it, which was all I needed to know, and I collapsed onto the moss. I had pushed my body hard, and it would be pushed no more. Though my stomach complained, food would have to wait until tomorrow. In the meantime, I slept. The next day, my body ached all over, and the scabs itched like mad. It was all I could do to sit on my hands to keep from scratching them off my face, my arms, my torso, just about everywhere, really. My feet looked ruined, with dried blood caked on my shoes and ankles. My hope was that it looked worse than it was, but I decided to wait to peel off my shoes. Another day would give the burst blisters and worn-away skin time to heal, hopefully enough not to tear open completely when the shoes came off. I could stand, but I winced with every step. I left the cave to look for food. The fish in the pool would have to wait until I jury-rigged a fishing pole or spear. The best I could do right now was to gather fruit and vegetables, assuming I trusted them to be edible. I was so hungry it was like my body had never eaten before, which was an interesting thought. So interesting it circled inside my head for a while. I felt like I was thinking through cotton, but there was a thread attached to the thought that I wanted to pull on. I peed as soon as I left the cave, but I didn't feel the urge to do anything else. And that was after nearly a full day on this world. Pee. Pee but no poop. What if there was nothing to poop? What if this body was brand new and had never eaten before? Ever? When I saw my face yesterday, a part of me worried that my consciousness had taken over some poor kid's body, or the body was dead and my consciousness reanimated it. Both scenarios turned my stomach, and I was glad to have evidence contradicting them. It was weird evidence, not entirely conclusive, but evidence all the same. All I needed to prove the hypothesis was not eat for another day and see if the no poop thing held, which would provide me with proof that I was in a brand new body. Which was disturbing too, just not as disturbing as replacing someone else's soul. I found a stand of fennel, a plum tree, and a bush dotted with bright red berries. The fennel grew near the stream, so the soil was wet and soft. I dug it out with my hands. The plums I carried in my shirt, and I left the damn berries alone. They looked like they'd bury a bear. It was possible the fennel and plums were also poisonous on this world, but I needed to eat something, just not right then. I needed to wait to see if I pooped first. I put my head in my hands. If the situation weren't so traumatic, I'd laugh myself silly. The afternoon passed slowly. I slept intermittently and rested to give my body time to recover. To give myself something to do, and fight the temptation to eat, I considered my circumstances. I had read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, so the idea of alternate worlds wasn't shocking, just actually being in one. The problem was in identifying what kind of alternate world I was in. Was it a portal fantasy, a la Joel Rosenberg's Guardian of the Flame? Or perhaps one of the more modern isekai versions coming out of Asia? I could also have been captured by an alien intelligence and put in a terrarium for observation. Or trapped in a bizarre virtual reality experience gone wrong, perhaps instituted by a rogue artificial intelligence reviving cryogenically frozen Portlanders from its past. Okay, the last scenario was stretching things, but the fact that I couldn't be absolutely sure was troubling. There wasn't anything I could be confident about other than that the experience was real. Well, actually, no. There was one thing. Magic existed in this world. The crow didn't pull a rabbit out of his hoop. The snake was enormous, its head almost a foot across. No magic trick that. I had nothing better to do with my time, so I closed my eyes and felt for the magic, force, ki, mana, whatever the world called it. For 30 minutes, I listened to the waterfall, but felt nothing. Nothing mystical, anyway. I still itched terribly all over my body. In the stories I'd read, the magic didn't always come from outside. Sometimes it was powered by internal energies. I turned my attention inward. This was more familiar as I started meditating and doing qigong after my wife Helen died. I'd actually tried a lot of things to find solace, but there were only a couple of disciplines that stuck. At first, the pain in my feet dominated my attention, and I let it. The poor things went through heck yesterday. After a time, I became aware of my body's other aches and pains. Eventually, though, the discomfort faded into the background, and I found my way to my breath, and the sensations of the cool air flowed through my nose, up and down my trachea, into and out of my lungs. I kept my attention on my breath for an hour, immersed but in the familiar. Even the panic inside quieted. And once I reached a stable point of equanimity, I noticed a bubble under my thoughts. Curious, I prodded it with my attention. An image appeared in my mind's eye, my Android phone, except it was made of a silvery metal with a dark copper band looped vertically around the screen. Looking closer, I saw the edges of sprockets in the gaps between the screen and its housing. The phone turned on. Printed on the screen in English was name, blank, age, 8, strength, 8, constitution, 8, agility, 8, intelligence, 8, wisdom, 8, spirit, 8, charm, 8, luck, 8. I couldn't help as decades of tabletop gaming surged up. You may as well call me 8 with these numbers. And then the screen updated. Name, 8, age, 8. Strength 8, Constitution 8, Agility 8, Intelligence 8, Wisdom 8, Spirit 8, Charm 8, Luck 8. That was more of an observation, not a request. I don't actually want to be called 8. My name is Oliver. Ollie works too. Also, is there a help screen? Because I'd really like to know what's going on. If anyone was listening, they didn't respond, and the name didn't budge. I tried willing it to change, but the name 8 felt sturdy, like it was etched in the metal. After a couple of minutes, I gave up. Apparently, I was now named 8, and I was stuck in a world with a game system layered onto it. And I am going to stop there, so...